Hey guys, Emily here, your Harvest Market dietitian. I'm in my kitchen here at Harvest Market, and today we're gonna make a homemade pizza crust and pizza. So we're gonna start our yeast dough. So this is made with a quick rise yeast. I'm using this kind. You can use whatever quick rise yeast that you have. I use the quick rise because it gives you just that, a quick dough that can be done in about an hour or 2 hours, depending on how warm your room is. You can also do this the day before and actually allow your dough to rise overnight in the fridge. So in this bowl, I have 1 package of this yeast. This is about 1/4 of an ounce. So if you have a bigger size than that, so just measure it out to about 1/4 of an ounce. And I also have some sugar in there. So that's really important. The sugar is gonna be the food for the yeast. So think of the yeast as kind of sleeping. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna add some warm water to this, and that's gonna wake up the yeast, and the sugar is going to feed the yeast. So I'm gonna add about 1.5 cups of warm water. So this water is about, you want about like 110 degrees, just slightly warmer than lukewarm, because we want to wake up the yeast. We don't want to kill the yeast. So too hot water will actually kill that yeast, and it won't give you a nice risen dough. So the other thing to keep in mind is remembering that yeast is a living thing. So if you're blooming your yeast, which is what we're doing right now, when we're adding the water and the sugar, and it doesn't start to bubble and look like it's waking up and look alive, then your yeast is probably no good. So make sure you look at the expiration date on your yeast, and if it doesn't bubble up, then you need to start over. Don't think that just because you are baking that it's going to somehow revitalize your yeast. You want to make sure that it's good from the get-go. So we're gonna go ahead and let this sit for about 5 or 10 minutes. And again, we want it to be kind of bubbly and foamy, and then our mixture is ready to make into a dough. Today, we're gonna be using this unbleached all-purpose flour right here. Unbleached just because that's what I have in my pantry. Doesn't have to be by any means. So I like to use all-purpose flour because it's all-purpose, right? We can make bread out of it, cakes, muffins, cookies, pizza crust, and it's really accessible. Now the thing that we have to keep in mind when substituting different flours for different recipes is really the protein content of the flour, and that's what differs between all of the flours. When we're talking about bread flour and pastry flour and cake flour, it's really the amount of protein in the flour. So think of the protein as kind of the strength of the flour. So the more kind of dense and hearty the product is, that's the more protein is in the flour. So for example, bread flour has a lot of protein in it because think about bread, you can rip it apart and those structures are really tight together, as opposed to kind of like a cookie or a muffin that has more of a tender crumb. That has less protein in it, like a cake flour or pastry flour. So all that said, we're gonna be using all-purpose because it's really kind of like middle of the road amount of flour, and that can really work in lots of different recipes. Now, if you wanted to do a part whole grain pizza crust, I recommend using this Bob's Red Mill whole wheat pastry flour. I like this the best because a lot of times when you add whole wheat flour to something, it becomes really dense and really, really heavy. And so this kind of, what it does, since it's pastry flour, it has less protein. So it's going to give a really nice tender crumb, and it's not super whole grain tasting. So you get all of the benefits of whole grains, like the fiber and the protein and the vitamins and minerals, but you're not getting really any of the nasty bitterness that you can get from some whole grain flours. So our yeast mixture is ready to go. It's slightly bubbling and foaming on top. So it's really cold in my kitchen. I usually like this to get a little bit more foamy. So probably at home, you're gonna see that there's more foaming and bubbling on top, and that is absolutely normal. It means that your yeast is alive, it's ready to make some delicious pizza crust. So the next step, what we're gonna do is we're gonna measure the flour right into this bowl with the water, yeast, and the sugar. What I like to do with the flour to make sure that I'm measuring correctly is actually take it out of the bag and just put some into a bowl or container, If you keep your flour in a container already, you don't have to transfer it. But what this does is this allows me to get a better measurement of my flour rather than having it really, really packed. So the best way to do this is scooping in with a spoon. So just scooping that flour right into your cup, your measuring cup, kind of overflowing, and we're just gonna scrape the excess right off the top, just like this. Ta-da! And then it goes right into our yeast mixture. So we are doing 3 1/4 cups of the flour here. Again, scooping it on top and scrape. 2 cups. Who needs more flour? There's my 3rd cup and 1/4 cup. Right in. Excellent. So this crust is really forgiving, actually. So if you find that you're mixing up your crust and it feels a little wet, you can always add a little bit more flour. Or if it feels really dry, you can add a little bit more water. That's what I love about this. It's pretty foolproof. So a couple things that I'm gonna add to this, just for some flavor. I'm gonna add a little bit of dried oregano. I love oregano in my pizza. Oh, to me that tastes like true pizza right there. Dried oregano. You can leave it out if you want to. Maybe add some red pepper flakes or Italian seasoning. I just got some salt here. So we need to make sure that we flavor our crust. We don't want it just completely bland. It's really kind of the flavor base. So we want to make sure it tastes really good too. Then I just have some olive oil right here. Olive oil is just gonna make it nice and tender. It's gonna give us a nice crispy crust. Whatever oil you have, whatever you use at home, is just fine. I like the flavor of olive oil, and that's what I always have in my pantry, so that's what I'm using. Now I'm putting on gloves because this is the fun part. We are going to mix everything right in here. I like to mix with my hands. My hands are my best tool in the kitchen. You can do this with a spatula or a wooden spoon, but why dirty a dish when you can use your hands? So I like to put on gloves because it sometimes gets really messy. So I'm just gonna kind of gently stir in my flour so it can soak up all of the liquid, and flour can get hydrated. So I'm just kind of turning the bowl and mixing everything together. Beautiful. So it's gonna be kind of shaggy, which is fine. And I'm kind of just turning and then squeezing my flour so it can soak up the moisture. The thing that I love about this dough recipe is that we're actually not even gonna turn this out onto the counter at this point. This just stays right in our bowl. So it is gonna be mixed in our bowl, and it's gonna rise in the same bowl that it's mixed in. So I'm just gonna kind of knead it a few times. So I'm simply going to kind of take a piece of this and fold it over and just kind of mush it back in. It's okay if it feels a little bit sticky at this point. I'd rather go a little bit more wet than too dry, because then it won't really rise that well. So what we're gonna do now, this is good to me. I feel good about this. This looks really yummy. So again, it's kind of a shaggy, more sticky dough, but it's still pretty cohesive. So at this point, we're gonna take a little bit of olive oil or whatever oil you used in here, and we're gonna oil this side of our bowl. And I'm just gonna kind of rub it around with my hands. This is going to allow that dough to rise really, really, really easily, because it's gonna be nice and slippery. So it's gonna be able to go up the sides of the bowl with ease. So just kind of roll it around. Should be a little bit shiny. Excellent. So then from here, all you're gonna do is top it. So you can top it with saran wrap. If you have a bowl fitted with a sealed lid, use that. Put it in a warm place. So if you have a radiator or heater on top of your fridge, even if you want to warm up your oven a little bit and turn on your oven and get that warm, again, not hot, because we don't want to hurt our dough, we just need a warm space. And this will be done in about 1 to 2 hours depending on how warm. Alternatively, you can let it rise in your fridge overnight for about 8 to 12 hours. All right, so our dough is nice and risen. I did this one in the fridge overnight, and this is how it's going to look when it's done. So it's gonna be really big and beautiful, kind of shaggy a little bit, kind of loose. And that's exactly what we want. That means that our yeast is nice and alive and active, and it smells delicious already. So I'm just gonna pull the sides of the dough from this bowl here, and it's just absolutely beautiful. And you see it doesn't stick very much because of that oil that we put in there. So I'm going to turn this out onto my flour, and I'm going to flour it generously because we have slightly wetter dough here. So I want to make sure that I flour so it doesn't stick. All right, so from here, we're just gonna kind of knead just a few times. And really, this is just going to allow us to incorporate some of this flour so that our dough doesn't stick to our counter. So to knead, I'm just gonna kind of pull a piece of the dough over and push it down. And this, we're really not kneading much here. This is almost kind of like a no-knead pizza crust. So we really want to kind of form it into the shape that you're going to eventually roll it out in. And I'm just kind of smooshing it down with my knuckles right here. You can see just how nice and malleable it is. It's really, really elastic, and that is what a yeast dough will give us. So don't be afraid to throw more flour down. We don't want this guy to stick on our countertops. So what I like to do when I am doing my pizza crust, make sure that you keep your dough moving at all times, because there's nothing worse than rolling out a beautiful piece of pizza dough and then it sticks to your counter. So just make sure after every time you roll, you're moving, flipping your crust. The other thing that you got to keep in mind when we're working with a yeast crust is that we want to roll from the center out. So instead of rolling back and forth like you would maybe if you were doing cookies, a yeast dough is really elastic, so it'll keep going back in on you. So it's really important to make sure that you're starting from the center and then rolling out in each direction, so we can really start to get the size and the shape that we want, and it's not just going back in on itself. All right, so as you can see, this makes a lot of pizza crust, and that's okay. So this will make about 2.5 medium-sized pizzas, like 2 pizzas and a personal pizza, or 1 extremely large pizza. I don't have a pan this size, nor will this fit in my oven. I don't know about you guys, but what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this pan here. So this is a 12-inch pan, and this is just kind of your standard medium-sized pizza pan. And what I like to do is I'm just gonna lay that right here. Gonna take my pizza cutter, and you have to remember too that when we cut this, it's going to kind of retract back on itself because it's very stretchy. So I'm gonna do this just right around the outside, taking my pizza cutter because it's gonna stretch back in on itself a little bit. Doesn't have to be perfect. This can also easily go in a rectangle pan for sure. You don't have to have a circular pizza pan. You can make these any shape you want to. And then we'll take this. You can knead this back up, roll it out into another pizza crust. So we're gonna take this guy and we're gonna roll it out a little bit more. So the great thing about making your own pizza crust is that you can really determine how thick or thin you want your crust. I like a nice thin crispy crust, so I'm gonna make sure I roll it out nice and thin. So what I'm looking for is that when I roll it out, it doesn't start to scoop back in on itself. That's how I know it's rolled out nice and thin, is when it kind of stays put where I roll it. And you can always cut this and trim this more if you need to. All right, a couple more rolls. And then we'll transfer. I can never get the perfect size pizza, and that's okay. Luckily, it doesn't change the taste. All right, so I've got my pizza pan here. I'm gonna take some cornmeal. So cornmeal is going to help the pizza crust not to stick to our pan. This is a non-stick pan, but we just want to help it out a little bit more best we can. Be generous with your sprinkles. We don't want it sticking. All right, then I'm gonna take my pizza crust, gonna roll it back on this rolling pin. Ta-da! Take this, I'm gonna trim any excess. Remember, it will kind of come back on itself, so don't go too far inward on your crust. There we go. I like to have a nice crispy crust. The great thing about this is too, it actually makes a beautiful stuffed crust. So if you want to take some cheese, stick it in there, fold it over, you can have your very own stuffed crust pizza. So guys, I want to mention too that at this point in time, you can actually freeze your crust. So I would freeze it just like this. You want to freeze it flat. And then you can transfer it, you can wrap it up in saran wrap and have ready to go pizza crust when you are. You just stick it right in the oven. Okay, so now we're going to prep our pizza dough to be par baked in the oven. So par baking is just partially baking the crust so that we kind of get a nice crispy crust so it doesn't end up soggy. So what we're gonna do here is we are going to give it a little poke with a fork. So this dough will puff up in your oven slightly. So just by poking it with a fork, we're gonna be creating some holes for this steam to escape. If you don't do this, you're gonna look in your oven, it's gonna look like a giant pillow pizza crust in your oven. And then we're gonna do an olive oil topping here. What this is gonna do is, again, really flavorful crust. It's gonna give us a nice crispy crust on top to work from. So I'm gonna just do some of my olive oil. I've got some Italian seasoning that I'm gonna add to it. You can just do olive oil, do whatever you have if you have a favorite Italian seasoning that you like. So I'm just gonna kind of drizzle this with a basting brush, and then I'm just going to baste it right on. It doesn't need to be excessive because we are gonna be putting toppings on this pizza, but I do wanna put enough so that we can get some nice brown and crispiness going on. So I'm gonna pop our crust in the oven for a par bake. We're gonna do this at a hotter temperature, 420, 425, depending on how hot your oven runs. So we're just gonna pop this right in. Okay, so while your pizza crust is par baking, now is a perfect time to prep all of your toppings. So I have a few different toppings here. The best thing about making your own homemade pizza is that you can put whatever you want to on there. So use what you have, use what you like. Today I'm gonna do some red onion. So I'm just gonna do some thin slices of this red onion. Probably not gonna use the whole thing. And if you don't like red onion, simply leave it off. So I'm just gonna take off the outside piece. And I'm just gonna do some really, really thin slices here. Beautiful. So this is just for one pizza, so I don't need very much. So I'm gonna put these guys into a little bowl. That'll be ready when my pizza is ready. Next up, we're gonna do some yellow bell pepper. I love bell peppers on my pizza. Again, you don't have to put this on your pizza, just a suggestion. This is how I like to cut up my bell peppers. So I'm cutting off the top, just like a little hat. I'm gonna pull out the middle and any of that white part, any of the pith or the seeds. And I'm just gonna pop the stem off. And then this is all usable right here. So you can cut this into slices, into dices, however you want to. I like to make sure that each bite gets a little bit of this. So I'm gonna do kind of a nice dice on this. Doesn't have to be perfect by any means. However much of that you want, you can save the rest to throw into something else, maybe an omelet, or eat as a snack with some hummus. Just give it all a nice rough chop so you can get pretty much uniform pieces. Beautiful. All right, so those are ready. Next up, I have this really, really delicious uncured turkey pepperoni. So this is a great option if you want some leaner meat on your pizza. So we're gonna use these. The other thing I'm gonna use are canned artichokes. So I love artichokes on my pizza, but there's no way that I'm going to cook and cut up a fresh artichoke. It takes way too long. So I'm gonna use the canned. Since they are in a liquid, I'm going to drain that liquid. So these aren't the ones that are marinated in anything. This is simply water in the can. So what I like to do is I like to drain these really, really well. And then the other thing that we're gonna do is squeeze them dry, because they do retain a lot of moisture being in the can with all that liquid. So I'm gonna take them out, and from here I'm gonna give them a rough chop, just so I can get some smaller pieces. If you like them in big pieces, just keep them that way. Any way you like it is just fine. I just like a little smaller chop on my artichoke. And then from here, I'm gonna take handfuls of the artichoke and I'm gonna squeeze all that liquid out, because it's a lot of liquid right there. And then they're just gonna go back on my cutting board here with my other prepped veggies. Excellent, squeeze. You're gonna get a lot of liquid out of there. And this is gonna ensure that it doesn't make your pizza really soggy and stays nice and crisp. All right, the last thing that we have here, besides the cheese and the sauce, of course, is some spinach. I love a little green on my pizza. So the other thing that I try to do when I'm making a pizza, you know, how much color can I get on there? So I think we've got some pretty good color represented on this pizza here. I'm hand tearing my spinach. I feel like it's a really kind of easy way to do this. And baby spinach is very tender, so you don't really need to chop it. It's kind of harsh for the baby spinach. So just give it a nice hand tear. And know that your spinach will wilt once it gets on that pizza. So I don't worry too much about having really small pieces of that. All right, all our toppings are ready to go. So our par-baked crust is ready to go. You'll notice that it has a little bit of brown spots on top. It's kind of crispy to the touch, but it's not completely cooked all the way through. That's exactly what we're looking for. So I have all my toppings ready to go. I've got my sauce, so we're gonna assemble our pizza. Use whatever sauce you like, whatever pizza sauce. Pizza sauce is typically different than a regular pasta sauce in that it's a lot thicker, so it won't spread. It has less moisture, so it's gonna make your crust less soggy. I really like this kind. It's called Di Fratelli's. It has a great flavor. It's really yummy. It's a great all-purpose pizza sauce, but again, use whatever you like. So you see this big old bubble right here? So yeah, I told you that before. You gotta poke it with a fork, and even sometimes when you poke it with a fork, it's still gonna bubble up, but I think it looks great. And you can always kind of push it back down. Let some of that air escape, no big deal. So you can make your pizza as saucy or as non-saucy as you want to. Again, the great thing about making your own. And go up clear to the edge, why not? So as you can see, this pizza crust kind of shrunk a little when it was in the oven, and that's very common. So when you're putting your crust together on your pizza pan, make sure that it isn't too far away from the edges, because it will shrink when it cooks. Beautiful. So here's our sauce. Next up, I'm actually gonna put spinach on the very bottom, and this allows my spinach to be able to wilt really nicely without burning on top. If we put it on the very top, it's definitely going to burn, and we don't want that to happen. So put it on the bottom and it will be protected by all the other veggies and the cheese and everything else. Excellent. Next up, I'm gonna put some of my artichoke hearts. So we are most likely going to have some extra toppings left over, right? And that's totally fine. In fact, sometimes I do this on purpose so that I can toss them into a bag. These can go into a salad. Again, they can go in an omelet. They can go on another pizza that you make, maybe, you know, next week, I don't know. But you can definitely use these veggies. Don't throw them away. Put them in a safe spot in your fridge, and be creative in ways that you can use them. Yellow bell pepper on next. This is looking really beautiful and really delicious, if I do say so myself. Alrighty, there we go. We're gonna do some of those turkey pepperonis here. Maybe. Just a few of these right on top. These are already cooked, ready to go. Beautiful. Lay it right on top. many as you want. Get some in each bite. And last, we're gonna do some of the thinly sliced red onion. I choose red onion. Red onion is typically the most widely used red onion to eat raw. It has a lot of flavor. It's kind of less pungent than your white onion or yellow onion. But again, if you're not a fan, leave it off. You could also add some mushrooms, some black olives, whatever you like. All right. Next is the best part, cheese, right? So we've got I have an Italian cheese blend, shredded, that we're just gonna put right on top. Sprinkle it all around. As much cheese as you want. The great thing about pizza, you can't really mess it up, right? Add as much or as little. Excellent. Alrighty guys, I think our pizza is ready to go back in the oven. All right, so we're gonna go back into our preheated oven about 420, 425, nice and hot. We're really just looking to kind of crisp up the bottom of that crust a little bit and melt all that cheese. So guys, our pizza is done, and this is our final product right here. So you know when your pizza is done when the edges are nice and crispy on your crust, and the cheese is nice and browned and bubbly, and it's smelling really, really good. So remember guys, you can find all of this and more on our social media pages on Facebook, Instagram, and our website. Thank you so much for cooking with me today. We'll see you next time.